Today, we're diving into a moment in history that completely changed the world, the time when millions of people walked away from farms and fields into massive, loud, and often dangerous buildings to work. This is the story of the factory machine. Okay, so think about your day. School, homework, maybe practice, or just hanging out. Feels pretty long sometimes, doesn't it? Well, let's put that feeling into a whole new perspective. 14. That's the number, 14 hours. That was a typical workday back then. And honestly, a lot of the time it was even longer. Just try to imagine working for pretty much every single moment you're awake. So how on earth did we get here? How did life change so dramatically, so fast? Let's break down this enormous shift from a life lived at home to a new reality that was ruled by the factory. All right, so before all these factories popped up, life was, well, different. Most people worked under what's called the domestic system. Basically, you worked from your own home, making things like clothes or tools. You were kind of your own boss. You worked when the sun was up and you rested when it went down. But then, the factory system changed absolutely everything. Suddenly, you weren't listening to the sun anymore. You were listening to a clock on a wall. A boss told you when to start, when to stop, and you did it all crammed inside one giant building. So why build these places in the first place? It really all came down to new inventions. These incredible new machines could make things way faster than any person could. The only catch was that they were huge. I mean, absolutely massive. There's no way you could fit one in your little cottage. So entrepreneurs, business owners, had an idea. They built these enormous buildings, these factories, specifically to house the giant machines. And they were smart about it. They built them right next to rivers to use the water's power to run everything. And just like that, the modern factory was born. Okay, but what was it really like to work in one of these places? Let's imagine we're walking through those factory doors and taking a look at what a day in the life of a worker was actually like. The workday was just relentless. It would kick off at 6 in the morning and you wouldn't be done until maybe 8 or 9 at night. And your break? A measly 30 minutes for lunch. Most of the time you didn't even get to sit down. You just ate right there at your machine. Think about this. In the winter, you'd go to work before the sun came up and leave long after it had set. You would literally never see daylight. And it wasn't just the long hours. These places were death traps, seriously. There were no safety features, none. You had huge iron gears grinding out in the open, leather belts spinning like crazy, and oily, slippery floors everywhere. If a piece of your clothing or even your hair got caught, you could lose a finger, an arm, or your life in a split second. And the worst part? If you got hurt, that was it. You were fired on the spot. Now, let's talk about the noise. Try to imagine the sound of hundreds of massive iron machines all clanking and grinding at the exact same time. It was a constant, deafening roar. It was so loud you couldn't even shout to the person standing right next to you. Workers had to invent their own hand signals just to communicate. And after years of that, a lot of them lost their hearing for good. Even the air you breathed could make you sick. In the textile mills, the air was just choked with tiny bits of dust and cotton fibers. And get this, they kept the windows sealed shut on purpose. They wanted the air to be hot and humid because they thought it kept the cotton threads from breaking. The result? Workers developed something they called mill fever. It was this horrible constant cough from all the gunk building up in their lungs. This next part is, well, it's tough to wrap your head around. A huge part of the workforce was children. And I don't mean teenagers looking for a summer job. We're talking about kids as young as 6 or 7 years old, starting their careers in these factories. Why children? Well, because they were small, and their size was exploited for the absolute riskiest jobs imaginable. They were the ones who had to crawl underneath the machines while they were still running to clean out jams or fix a broken thread. One wrong move, one slip, and it was over. And they worked the same brutal hours as the adults for way less pay and with none of the protections kids have today. So you have to be asking, why? Why would anyone put up with this? Why would parents send their kids into a place like this? The answer is just heartbreakingly simple. They had to. There was no other choice. The pay was terrible, just awful. And it wasn't fair either. Men got paid the most. Women doing the exact same job got paid less. And kids? They earned just a few pennies for a whole day's work. The only way a family could survive was if everyone worked, mom, dad, and the kids. And even then, with all of them working those insane hours, they were barely making enough for food and a tiny one-room apartment. And if that wasn't bad enough, some factory owners had this nasty trick up their sleeve called the truck system. Here's how the scam worked. Instead of paying you in actual money, they'd pay you with vouchers. But, and here's the catch, you could only spend those vouchers at one place, the store owned by the factory. And guess what? The prices at that store were way higher than anywhere else. It was a clever but totally cruel way to trap workers in debt to their own boss. The discipline inside the factory was just brutal. You had these overseers, basically supervisors, constantly patrolling the floors, watching everyone. If you were a minute late, you got fined. Talk to the person next to you, you got fined. For kids, it was even worse. They could be hit with a leather strap or forced to do awful things like hold heavy weights over their heads for an hour. The whole place just ran on fear. And after that endless day was finally over, going home wasn't much of an escape. People lived in these cramped, shabby houses that were thrown up super quickly. There was no indoor plumbing, so everyone shared these gross outdoor toilets. Garbage was just piled up in the streets. It was the perfect breeding ground for deadly diseases like cholera and typhus, which would just spread like wildfire. But there's a limit to what people can take. And eventually, workers started to figure something out, that alone, they were powerless. But together, together, they might just have a chance. This is where the long, hard fight for fairness really begins. One of the first groups to really fight back was known as the Luddites. Now, it's easy to think they were just people who hated technology, but it was way more complicated than that. These were skilled workers, artisans, whose entire way of life was being wiped out by these new machines. So what did they do? They fought back by breaking the very machines that were destroying their livelihoods. Now, this change did not happen overnight. Not even close. It was a long, slow grind. At first, workers had to meet in secret because forming any kind of group was actually illegal. From there, you got protests like the Luddites, which eventually led to the very first labor unions. Every single one of these steps was a massive risk, but each one built on the last, slowly paving the way for things to get better. And then came the first real breakthrough, the Factory Act of 1833. Was it perfect? No, not by a long shot, but it was a huge first step. It made it illegal for kids under 9 to work in textile mills. It put a limit on the hours older kids could work. And this is so important. It said that child workers had to get 2 hours of school every day. For the very first time, the government was actually stepping in and saying, we have to protect these people. So what does all of this old history have to do with you? Well, pretty much everything. The fight these workers started is the reason we have things that we just think of as normal. Things like an 8-hour workday, weekends, safety rules that keep people from getting hurt on the job, and of course, laws that say kids should be in school, not in factories. Their struggle from over 200 years ago continues to shape and protect our lives every single day.